I'm Maya, 32, and I thought our family dinner would be the usual weekly gathering with my parents, my sister Sophia, and my husband Mark. Instead, it became the moment Sophia looked across the table with a satisfied smile and announced, "I have wonderful news, I'm pregnant, and Mark is the father." The silence that followed was deafening until she added, "We've been together for 6 months, and we're so happy to finally be able to share our love with the family." What they didn't know was that their betrayal had just triggered the most systematic and devastating revenge campaign of my life, and that within 60 days, they would lose everything they'd ever worked for while I rebuilt my life stronger than before. But before I tell you how I destroyed both their lives with surgical precision while they thought they'd won the ultimate prize, I need to know, what would you have done if your sister announced she was pregnant with your husband's baby at a family dinner? Would you have screamed? Left immediately? Or started planning the kind of revenge that would make them regret ever crossing you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe because this betrayal and revenge story is about to get absolutely nuclear. To understand how my sister's pregnancy announcement became the catalyst for the most comprehensive revenge campaign I'd ever orchestrated, you need to know about the carefully constructed life that Mark and I had built together over 7 years of marriage. From the outside, we appeared to be the perfect couple, successful professionals who'd created a beautiful home, traveled extensively, and seemed destined for the kind of happily ever after that made other people envious of our relationship and lifestyle. Mark was a successful real estate developer who'd built his business from nothing into a multi-million-dollar operation that specialized in luxury residential properties and commercial developments. His charisma and business acumen had made him a respected figure in our city's development community, and his projects were consistently profitable and well-regarded for their quality and innovation. Our social circle included city planners, architects, contractors, and investors who viewed Mark as a rising star in the industry. I was equally successful in my own right as a forensic accountant who specialized in investigating financial fraud and embezzlement for law enforcement agencies and private clients. My work required meticulous attention to detail, comprehensive understanding of complex financial systems, and the ability to trace money through elaborate schemes designed to hide criminal behavior. The skills I developed in exposing other people's financial crimes would prove invaluable when I needed to systematically destroy the people who'd betrayed me. Our marriage had appeared strong and loving to everyone who knew us, built on shared goals, mutual respect, and genuine affection that had developed over 9 years of being together since we'd met in college. We'd traveled to over 20 countries, owned a beautiful home in the city's most prestigious neighborhood, and were actively trying to start a family that would complete our picture-perfect life together. But what I'd discovered over the past 6 months, what I'd been carefully documenting and investigating while pretending ignorance, was that Mark had been systematically cheating on me with multiple women, including several clients and business associates whose relationships with him had compromised his professional integrity and potentially exposed him to serious legal liability. The affair with my sister Sophia was just the latest and most devastating betrayal in a pattern of infidelity that had been going on for over 2 years. Sophia, my younger sister by 4 years, had always been the family favorite, the beautiful, charming daughter who seemed to effortlessly attract attention and admiration while I was positioned as the responsible, practical older sister who worked hard for her achievements. Sophia's career as a freelance marketing consultant was less stable and lucrative than mine, but her natural charisma and social skills had always made her seem more glamorous and exciting than my methodical, analytical approach to life and work. The relationship between Sophia and Mark had been developing for months under the guise of a professional consulting arrangement where she was supposedly helping him with marketing strategies for his real estate developments. Their business meetings had gradually become personal encounters, and their professional relationship had evolved into an affair that they'd been conducting in our family's social circle without my knowledge or suspicion. What made their betrayal particularly calculated and cruel was how they'd used my trust in both of them to facilitate their affair while making me complicit in their deception. Family dinners where all 3 of us were present had become opportunities for them to share secret glances and inside jokes while I remained oblivious to the relationship that was developing between the 2 people I loved most. My invitations for Sophia to join Mark and me for social events had actually provided cover for their affair by establishing a pattern of them being together that appeared innocent and family-oriented. The pregnancy announcement at our weekly family dinner was the culmination of months of planning and deception, designed not just to reveal their affair but to position it as a love story that deserved family support and acceptance rather than condemnation and rejection. Sophia's timing and presentation were carefully calculated to minimize my ability to respond with anger or accusations, while maximizing the likelihood that our parents would focus on the pregnancy and impending grandchild rather than the betrayal that had created the situation. But what neither Mark nor Sophia understood was that my work as a forensic accountant had taught me to recognize patterns of deception and to investigate suspicious behavior with methodical precision. The inconsistencies in Mark's schedule, the unexplained expenses in our joint accounts, and the changes in his communication patterns had triggered my professional instincts months before Sophia's pregnancy announcement confirmed what I'd already discovered through careful investigation. Over the past 6 months, I'd been systematically documenting Mark's infidelities, financial improprieties, and business practices that violated both legal standards and professional ethics. The evidence I'd collected included financial records showing misappropriation of client funds, documented instances of fraud in his development projects, and recorded conversations that proved he'd been using our marriage as cover for criminal activity that could result in federal prosecution. Sophia's involvement in Mark's business had also exposed her to legal liability that she was completely unaware of, as her marketing consultation had included assistance with financial documentation that contained fraudulent information and misleading representations to investors and regulatory agencies. Her pregnancy announcement had just provided me with additional motivation to ensure that both of them faced full consequences for their betrayal and criminal behavior. The family dinner where they'd announced their affair and pregnancy was supposed to be their moment of triumph, when they'd finally be able to stop hiding their relationship and start building a life together with family support and approval. Instead, it became the moment when I decided that their betrayal would cost them everything they'd ever worked for, and that their happiness would be built on the ruins of the lives I was about to systematically destroy. The 6 months leading up to Sophia's pregnancy announcement had been the most methodical and comprehensive investigation of my professional career, as I'd used every forensic accounting skill I'd developed to uncover the full scope of Mark's criminal behavior and document evidence that would ensure his complete destruction. What had started as suspicion about his changed behavior had evolved into a systematic examination of his business practices, financial records, and personal relationships that revealed criminal activity far more extensive than simple marital infidelity. The first indication that something was seriously wrong had come when I'd noticed irregularities in our joint bank accounts, small withdrawals and transfers that didn't match Mark's explanations about business expenses and client entertainment. My professional training had taught me that financial deception often starts with minor inconsistencies that escalate over time, and Mark's spending patterns showed classic signs of someone hiding significant expenses from their spouse. Using my access to our shared financial accounts and my expertise in tracing money through complex transactions, I'd been able to reconstruct Mark's secret spending over the past 2 years. The evidence revealed that he'd been maintaining a lifestyle that far exceeded our legitimate income, funding expensive gifts for multiple women, luxury hotel stays, and travel expenses that were being hidden through a sophisticated system of business account manipulation and personal credit arrangements. But the financial infidelity was just the surface of Mark's criminal behavior. As I dug deeper into his business records, I'd discovered that his real estate development company was operating a complex fraud scheme that involved misrepresenting property values to investors, manipulating construction costs to inflate profits, and using client deposits for unauthorized purposes that violated both state regulations and federal banking laws. The most damaging evidence I'd collected involved Mark's relationships with city planning officials and building inspectors, relationships that included financial payments and personal favors that constituted bribery and corruption on a scale that could result in federal racketeering charges. Mark's successful track record in getting development permits and passing building inspections wasn't based on quality work and legitimate compliance, it was based on systematic corruption that had been going on for over 3 years. My investigation had also revealed that Mark had been using our marriage and my reputation as a forensic accountant to legitimize his business operations and provide cover for financial transactions that would have been questioned if he'd been operating as a single man with a less credible background. Several of his major investors had specifically mentioned their confidence in his integrity based on his marriage to someone who specialized in detecting financial fraud. The irony was devastating. My professional expertise in exposing criminal financial behavior had been used as a marketing tool to help Mark attract investors and clients who trusted him because they assumed I would have detected any improprieties in his business operations. The husband who'd been systematically betraying me personally had also been using my professional reputation to facilitate criminal behavior that could have destroyed my own career if I'd been found complicit in his schemes. Sophia's involvement in Mark's business had made her an unwitting participant in several of his fraudulent activities, as her marketing consultation had included creating promotional materials that contained false information about property values, construction timelines, and investment returns. Her social media expertise had been used to create online content that misrepresented the success and legitimacy of projects that were actually losing money or failing to meet regulatory requirements. The pregnancy that Sophia had announced with such satisfaction was also creating additional legal complications, as Mark's financial obligations for child support would require income disclosure that would expose the illegal sources of much of his wealth. The family they were planning to build together was being funded by criminal activity that would inevitably be discovered and prosecuted, leaving both of them facing prison time and financial ruin. But perhaps the most valuable evidence I'd collected was recorded conversations where Mark had explicitly acknowledged his criminal behavior and discussed strategies for avoiding detection and prosecution. Using surveillance equipment that my forensic accounting work had given me access to, I'd captured hours of conversations where Mark discussed bribing officials, manipulating financial records, and using fraudulent documents to secure loans and permits. The recordings also included conversations about his affair with Sophia and his plans to leave me once his current development projects were completed and the proceeds had been secured. Mark's discussions with his business partners revealed that he viewed our marriage as a temporary arrangement that provided professional cover and financial stability while he built wealth through illegal means that he planned to enjoy with other women. The most damning recordings captured Mark and Sophia planning their pregnancy announcement and discussing how they would handle my expected emotional reaction and the family dynamics that would follow their revelation. Their conversations revealed a level of calculation and manipulation that made it clear their affair wasn't a crime of passion but a deliberate strategy to destroy my life while building their own happiness on the ruins of everything I'd worked to create. Over 6 months of careful investigation, I'd assembled a comprehensive case file that included financial records, recorded conversations, documentary evidence, and witness statements that would support both criminal prosecution and civil litigation that could result in Mark losing his business, his freedom, and every asset he'd accumulated through his criminal activities. The evidence was so extensive and well documented that federal prosecutors would have everything they needed to secure convictions on multiple charges carrying decades in prison. But I'd also been careful to document Sophia's involvement in ways that would expose her to legal liability while protecting my own interests and ensuring that she couldn't claim ignorance or victimization when the criminal charges were filed. Her marketing work for Mark's business had created a paper trail that showed her participation in creating fraudulent promotional materials and her knowledge of misrepresentations that were being made to investors and regulatory agencies. The pregnancy announcement that was supposed to be their moment of triumph had actually provided me with the final piece of evidence I needed to destroy both of their lives completely. Their public declaration of their affair and plans to build a family together would make it impossible for them to claim that their relationship was professional rather than personal, and would expose them to additional charges related to conspiracy and fraud that might not have been applicable if they'd maintained the pretense of a business relationship. As I'd sat at that family dinner, listening to them announce their betrayal with such satisfaction and confidence, I'd been mentally reviewing the evidence that would send both of them to federal prison while I rebuilt my life with the assets I'd been systematically protecting from their criminal behavior. The moment Sophia finished announcing her pregnancy and her affair with Mark, I made a decision that would prove more devastating to them than any emotional outburst or dramatic confrontation could have been. Instead of reacting with anger or devastation, I smiled calmly, congratulated them on their wonderful news, and excused myself from the dinner with the explanation that I needed some time to process this unexpected development. What they interpreted as shock and defeat was actually the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign that would destroy both their lives within 60 days. My parents' reactions to Sophia's announcement had been confused and uncomfortable, as they struggled to understand how their two daughters' lives had become so entangled in such a destructive way. My mother's attempts to mediate and find some way to preserve family relationships were well-intentioned but completely unrealistic given the scope of the betrayal and the legal consequences that would soon follow. My father's focus on the practical implications of the situation, the divorce, the custody arrangements, the family dynamics, showed that he didn't understand the criminal behavior that would make all of those concerns irrelevant. Sophia's expectation that I would react with emotional devastation and desperate attempts to save my marriage revealed how completely she'd misunderstood both my character and the strength of my position. Her satisfaction with the announcement suggested that she viewed my marriage as something she'd won in competition with me, rather than understanding that she'd actually inherited a man whose criminal behavior would destroy her life just as thoroughly as it was about to destroy his. Mark's discomfort during the announcement had been palpable. Not because he felt guilty about betraying me but because he was beginning to recognize that my calm response might indicate knowledge or preparation that he hadn't anticipated. His attempts to gauge my reaction and control the narrative were unsuccessful because I'd already moved beyond the personal betrayal to focus on the criminal prosecution that would follow within days. The first step in my strategic response was to secure my own financial assets and legal position before Mark could realize that his criminal behavior had been discovered and take steps to hide evidence or transfer assets beyond the reach of law enforcement. Using my forensic accounting expertise and my knowledge of his business operations, I'd already begun the process of protecting myself from the financial consequences of his illegal activities. Over the past month, I'd been systematically transferring money from our joint accounts into individual accounts that Mark couldn't access, using legitimate business expenses and personal transactions that wouldn't trigger suspicion until it was too late for him to respond effectively. My understanding of his financial systems and business practices had allowed me to move significant assets without detection while documenting every transaction in ways that would support my divorce proceedings and protect me from any claims that I'd been involved in his criminal activities. The house we'd shared, which was worth over $2 million, was actually titled in my name alone due to inheritance money I'd used for the down payment and mortgage payments I'd made from my individual accounts. Mark's assumption that he had a claim to the property was based on his misunderstanding of our financial arrangements and his failure to pay attention to legal documents he'd signed without reading carefully. The second step was to activate the federal investigation that would expose Mark's criminal behavior and result in his prosecution for fraud, bribery, and racketeering. Using my professional contacts in law enforcement and my reputation as a forensic accountant who'd assisted with numerous federal investigations, I'd already provided preliminary information to FBI agents who specialized in financial crimes and public corruption cases. The evidence I'd collected over 6 months was being reviewed by federal prosecutors who were amazed by the comprehensiveness and quality of documentation that would support charges carrying potential sentences of decades in federal prison. The recorded conversations, financial records, and documentary evidence I'd assembled would make prosecution straightforward and conviction virtually certain. But I'd also been careful to structure my cooperation with law enforcement in ways that would protect my own interests while ensuring that both Mark and Sophia faced maximum legal consequences for their behavior. My status as a betrayed spouse who'd discovered criminal activity created strong motivation for cooperation that prosecutors found both credible and compelling. The third step was to initiate civil litigation that would ensure Mark lost every asset he'd accumulated through his criminal activities while protecting my own financial interests and establishing my right to compensation for the damages I'd suffered through his fraud and infidelity. The evidence of his criminal behavior would support civil claims that could result in treble damages and attorney fee awards that would leave him with no resources to fight either the criminal charges or the divorce proceedings. My knowledge of asset protection strategies and bankruptcy law had allowed me to structure these civil claims in ways that would be virtually impossible for Mark to discharge or avoid, even if he attempted to declare bankruptcy or transfer assets to family members or business associates. The fraudulent nature of his wealth accumulation would make it subject to recovery regardless of any legal maneuvers he might attempt. The fourth step was to expose Sophia's involvement in Mark's criminal activities in ways that would result in her facing serious legal consequences while destroying her ability to maintain custody of the child she was carrying. Her participation in creating fraudulent marketing materials and her knowledge of misrepresentations being made to investors and regulatory agencies had made her a co-conspirator whose pregnancy wouldn't protect her from prosecution. The evidence of Sophia's involvement in criminal activities would also support Child Protective Services intervention that could result in the baby being removed from her custody immediately after birth. The combination of criminal charges and documented involvement in fraud would make it impossible for her to argue that she could provide a safe and stable environment for a child. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of my strategic response was how it would destroy the relationship between Mark and Sophia by exposing the criminal liability that their affair had created. Once they understood that their romantic relationship had actually been a criminal conspiracy that would result in federal prosecution, their love story would become a mutual destruction pact that would pit them against each other in desperate attempts to minimize their own legal exposure. The pregnancy announcement that was supposed to be their moment of triumph would instead become evidence of their conspiracy and proof of their mutual involvement in criminal activities that would send both of them to federal prison while I rebuilt my life with assets I'd protected and a reputation I'd preserved through careful planning and strategic thinking. 7 days after Sophia's pregnancy announcement, federal agents executed simultaneous search warrants at Mark's business offices, our family home, and Sophia's apartment, seizing computers, financial records, and documents that would provide additional evidence for the comprehensive criminal case I'd been building for months. The investigation I'd triggered through my cooperation with federal prosecutors was moving with the speed and efficiency that characterized cases where the evidence was overwhelming and the crimes were clearly documented. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division had been particularly interested in Mark's case because it involved the perfect combination of financial fraud, public corruption, and organized criminal activity that federal prosecutors loved to pursue. The evidence I'd provided included not just proof of individual crimes but documentation of a systematic pattern of criminal behavior that suggested ongoing enterprise that fell under federal racketeering statutes carrying enhanced penalties. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who was leading the investigation, had told me that Mark's case was one of the most well-documented fraud schemes she'd encountered in 15 years of investigating financial crimes. The recorded conversations, financial records, and documentary evidence I'd collected had provided federal prosecutors with everything they needed to secure convictions without requiring extensive additional investigation or witness testimony that might be unreliable or contested. But what made the case particularly compelling for federal prosecutors was how Mark's criminal activities had expanded beyond simple fraud to include corruption of public officials, violations of banking regulations, and conspiracy that involved multiple participants across state lines. The scope of his criminal enterprise meant that successful prosecution would result in sentences measured in decades rather than years, and would serve as a deterrent to other developers who might be considering similar illegal strategies. The search of Mark's business offices had yielded additional evidence that exceeded even my comprehensive investigation, including computer files showing additional instances of fraud, bribery, and money laundering that I hadn't discovered during my 6 months of documentation. His failure to properly secure or destroy incriminating evidence had provided federal agents with a treasure trove of information that would support charges beyond what I'd originally anticipated. Mark's reaction to the federal raids had been panic and desperate attempts to contact attorneys who specialized in white-collar criminal defense, but the comprehensiveness of the evidence against him had made it difficult to find experienced counsel willing to take his case. Several prominent criminal defense attorneys had declined representation after reviewing preliminary information about the charges and evidence, recognizing that defending Mark would be a career-damaging lost cause that would generate negative publicity without realistic hope of successful outcome. Sophia's involvement in Mark's criminal activities had also attracted federal attention, as her marketing consultation had included assistance with activities that constituted mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud investors and regulatory agencies. Her pregnancy had not provided her with any protection from criminal prosecution, and federal prosecutors were treating her as a co-conspirator whose relationship with Mark had been both personal and criminal in nature. The most devastating development for both Mark and Sophia was how quickly their romantic relationship had deteriorated once they understood the legal consequences of their affair and business partnership. The love that had seemed so important when they were planning to destroy my marriage had evaporated as soon as they realized that their relationship had actually been a criminal conspiracy that would result in lengthy federal prison sentences for both of them. Mark's attempts to minimize his legal exposure by cooperating with federal prosecutors had included providing information about Sophia's involvement in criminal activities, essentially betraying her to protect himself in the same way he'd betrayed me to pursue their affair. His willingness to sacrifice her legal interests for his own benefit had shown Sophia exactly what kind of man she'd chosen over her sister and family relationships. Sophia's response had been equally self-serving, as she'd attempted to portray herself as an unknowing victim who'd been manipulated by Mark into participating in activities she hadn't understood were criminal. Her efforts to distance herself from criminal liability had included providing federal prosecutors with additional evidence about Mark's criminal activities and his explicit acknowledgement that he was violating laws and regulations. The mutual betrayal between Mark and Sophia had provided federal prosecutors with additional evidence and witness testimony that strengthened the case against both of them while eliminating any possibility that they might present a united defense or support each other through the legal proceedings. Their love story had become a case study in how criminal conspirators inevitably turn against each other when facing serious legal consequences. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the federal investigation was how it had completely validated my strategic decision to respond to their betrayal through legal channels rather than emotional confrontation. Every choice I'd made over the past 6 months, from documenting evidence to protecting assets to cooperating with law enforcement, had been proven correct by the rapid progress of the criminal case and the devastating impact on both Mark and Sophia. The financial investigation had also revealed that Mark's assets were subject to forfeiture under federal asset seizure laws, meaning that everything he'd accumulated through criminal activities could be seized by the government and ultimately distributed to victims of his fraud. The luxury cars, expensive jewelry, and business assets that he'd acquired through illegal means would be liquidated to provide restitution to investors and clients who'd been defrauded. Sophia's involvement in the criminal enterprise had also exposed her to civil liability that could result in financial judgments that would follow her for the rest of her life. Her participation in creating fraudulent marketing materials had made her jointly liable for damages suffered by investors who'd relied on misrepresentations that she'd helped create and distribute. The pregnancy that had been announced with such triumph was now complicating both Mark and Sophia's legal situations, as their child would be born while both parents were facing federal criminal charges that could result in decades in prison. The family they'd planned to build together was being destroyed by the same criminal activities that had funded their affair and enabled their relationship. As I watched federal agents systematically dismantling the lives that Mark and Sophia had built on betrayal and criminal behavior, I realized that my forensic accounting skills and strategic thinking had created a more devastating revenge than any emotional response could have achieved. The people who'd betrayed me were losing everything they'd worked for while I was emerging from their destruction stronger and more secure than I'd ever been. 28 days after the federal raids, the civil litigation I'd initiated was systematically dismantling Mark's financial empire while my divorce proceedings moved forward with the efficiency that comes from having overwhelming evidence and cooperative law enforcement agencies supporting your legal position. The combination of criminal charges and civil lawsuits had created a legal environment where Mark had no realistic defense strategies and Sophia was facing financial ruin that would extend far beyond any criminal sentences they might receive. My divorce attorney, Patricia Chen, was one of the most aggressive family law specialists in the city, and she'd been amazed by the quality and comprehensiveness of evidence I'd provided to support my claims for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The documented proof of Mark's criminal activities and systematic infidelity had created a divorce case that was essentially uncontested because his criminal defense attorneys had advised him not to fight any claims that might provide additional evidence for federal prosecutors. The asset protection strategies I'd implemented over the past 6 months had been so effective that Mark was discovering his financial position was far weaker than he'd realized, as properties and accounts he'd assumed were joint assets were actually titled in my name or protected through legal structures he'd failed to understand when he'd signed various documents without careful review. His assumption that our marriage had created community property rights had been based on misunderstanding of state laws and legal arrangements that heavily favored my financial interests. The family home, worth over $2 million, had been titled solely in my name due to inheritance money I'd used for the down payment and mortgage payments I'd made from individual accounts that Mark had never contributed to despite living in the property for 5 years. His belief that he had marital property rights to the house was legally baseless, leaving him without his primary residence at exactly the time when his business assets were being seized by federal authorities. My forensic accounting expertise had also allowed me to document that most of Mark's apparent wealth was actually the proceeds of criminal activities that were subject to federal asset forfeiture, meaning that even if he'd had legitimate claims to marital property, those assets were being seized by the government as fruits of criminal enterprise. The luxury lifestyle he'd been maintaining was being revealed as completely unsustainable once the illegal funding sources were eliminated. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the civil litigation was how it had exposed the extent to which Mark's business success had been dependent on his marriage to me and the professional credibility that my reputation provided to his operations. Several major investors and lenders had specifically cited their confidence in Mark's integrity based on his marriage to a forensic accountant who would presumably detect any financial improprieties in his business activities. The revelation that Mark had been using my professional reputation to facilitate criminal activities while systematically betraying me personally had created additional legal liability for fraud and misrepresentation that extended beyond the criminal charges he was already facing. Investors who'd been defrauded could now claim that they'd been specifically misled about the oversight and accountability that my involvement in Mark's life was supposed to provide. Sophia's legal situation had deteriorated even more dramatically as her involvement in Mark's criminal activities was being prosecuted as a separate conspiracy case that could result in her facing penalties equal to or greater than Mark's sentences. Her attempts to portray herself as an unknowing victim had been undermined by evidence showing her active participation in creating fraudulent marketing materials and her explicit knowledge of misrepresentations being made to investors and regulatory agencies. The pregnancy that had initially seemed like it might generate sympathy for Sophia was actually creating additional legal complications, as federal prosecutors were arguing that her decision to have a child with a known criminal during an ongoing investigation showed continued criminal intent and lack of remorse that warranted enhanced sentencing. The baby that was supposed to represent their love and commitment was being treated by the legal system as evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy. Child Protective Services had also become involved in Sophia's case, as her documented involvement in criminal activities and relationship with Mark had raised serious questions about her ability to provide a safe and stable environment for a child. The investigation into her fitness as a parent was being conducted simultaneously with the criminal prosecution, creating the possibility that she could lose custody of her baby immediately after birth regardless of any criminal sentences she might receive. The mutual betrayal between Mark and Sophia had escalated into open legal warfare as each attempted to minimize their own criminal liability by providing prosecutors with additional evidence against the other. Mark's cooperation with federal prosecutors had included detailed information about Sophia's knowledge and participation in criminal activities, while Sophia's defense strategy involved portraying Mark as a manipulative criminal who'd exploited her professional relationship for illegal purposes. Their romantic relationship had completely disintegrated under the pressure of criminal prosecution and mutual recrimination, with both of them apparently recognizing that their affair had been the catalyst for legal consequences that would destroy both their lives. The love that had seemed so important when they were betraying me had proven to be completely superficial when tested by the stress of federal criminal prosecution. The financial investigation had also revealed that Mark's support for Sophia during their affair had actually been funded through fraudulent activities, meaning that the gifts, travel, and lifestyle enhancements she'd enjoyed were all proceeds of criminal enterprise that were subject to forfeiture and recovery. The romantic relationship that had seemed so rewarding was being revealed as another form of fraud where she'd been receiving stolen money without understanding the criminal source of Mark's generosity. As the criminal and civil cases moved toward resolution, the contrast between my strategic preparation and their complete vulnerability was becoming increasingly apparent. While they were facing decades in federal prison and financial ruin that would follow them for the rest of their lives, I was emerging from their betrayal with my assets protected, my reputation enhanced, and my future secured through careful planning and professional expertise. The 60-day timeline I'd initially estimated for their complete destruction was proving to be conservative, as the federal investigation and civil litigation were moving faster than I'd anticipated due to the overwhelming evidence and their complete inability to mount effective defenses against charges that were supported by their own recorded statements and documented criminal activities. 53 days after Sophia's pregnancy announcement, both she and Mark were arrested on federal charges carrying potential sentences of up to 40 years in prison, while I was finalizing the sale of Mark's business assets to fund restitution payments to his fraud victims and secure my own financial position through divorce settlement negotiations that heavily favored my interests. The systematic destruction of their lives had proceeded even faster than I'd initially planned, as their complete lack of preparation for criminal prosecution had made them easy targets for federal prosecutors who rarely encountered such well-documented cases. The federal indictment against Mark included 37 separate charges ranging from mail fraud and wire fraud to bribery, money laundering, and racketeering conspiracy that painted a comprehensive picture of criminal enterprise that had been operating for over 3 years. The evidence supporting each charge was so overwhelming that Mark's defense attorneys had advised him to accept a plea agreement that would still result in a minimum 20-year federal prison sentence in exchange for cooperation that might prevent a life sentence. Sophia's indictment was equally devastating, with federal prosecutors treating her as a full co-conspirator whose marketing expertise had been essential to the success of Mark's fraudulent schemes. Her pregnancy had not generated any sympathy from prosecutors who viewed her decision to have a child with a known criminal as evidence of continued criminal intent and lack of remorse that warranted enhanced penalties under federal sentencing guidelines. The plea negotiations for both defendants had been complicated by their mutual betrayal and competing attempts to minimize individual liability by providing evidence against each other. Mark's cooperation with prosecutors had included detailed testimony about Sophia's knowledge and participation in criminal activities, while Sophia's defense strategy had involved portraying Mark as a manipulative criminal who'd exploited her professional relationship and personal feelings for illegal purposes. Their romantic relationship had been completely destroyed by the pressure of criminal prosecution, with both of them apparently recognizing that their affair had been based on criminal conspiracy rather than genuine love or compatibility. The passion that had motivated them to betray me and destroy our family relationships had proven to be completely superficial when tested by the stress of federal criminal charges and mutual legal combat. The financial consequences of their criminal prosecution had been equally devastating, as federal asset forfeiture proceedings had seized virtually everything Mark had accumulated over the past 5 years of criminal activities. The luxury cars, expensive jewelry, business equipment, and real estate investments that had funded his impressive lifestyle were being liquidated to provide restitution to fraud victims and cover the costs of federal prosecution. Sophia's financial situation was even worse, as her involvement in criminal activities had exposed her to civil liability that exceeded her ability to pay and would follow her for decades regardless of any criminal sentences she might serve. The marketing business she'd built over 6 years of professional work had been completely destroyed by her association with Mark's criminal enterprise, leaving her unemployable in her chosen field and facing financial judgments that would prevent her from rebuilding her career. The pregnancy that had been announced with such triumph was now complicating every aspect of Sophia's legal situation, as Child Protective Services had determined that her documented involvement in criminal activities and relationship with Mark made her unfit to provide safe and stable care for a newborn child. The custody evaluation process was being conducted while she was facing federal criminal charges, creating the likelihood that she would lose parental rights regardless of any plea agreement she might negotiate. The baby that was supposed to represent Mark and Sophia's love and commitment was instead becoming another victim of their criminal behavior, as the child would be born into a situation where both parents were facing lengthy federal prison sentences and had no financial resources to provide appropriate care or support. The family they'd planned to build together was being destroyed by the same criminal activities that had enabled their affair and relationship. My own legal situation had been completely vindicated by the federal investigation and criminal prosecutions, as my cooperation with law enforcement and comprehensive documentation of criminal activities had established me as a victim rather than a participant in Mark's criminal enterprise. The forensic accounting expertise that Mark had used to legitimize his business operations had ultimately been the instrument of his destruction when I'd applied those same skills to investigating and exposing his criminal behavior. The divorce settlement I negotiated was far more favorable than I'd initially expected, as Mark's criminal conviction and asset forfeiture had eliminated his ability to claim any significant marital property while establishing my right to compensation for damages I'd suffered through his fraud and betrayal. The house, investment accounts, and business interests that I'd carefully protected were now clearly established as my separate property that Mark had no legal claim to despite our 7 years of marriage. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of their complete collapse was how it had vindicated my strategic decision to respond to their betrayal through legal channels rather than emotional confrontation. Every choice I'd made over the past 6 months, from documenting evidence to protecting assets to cooperating with law enforcement, had been proven correct by the devastating impact on both Mark and Sophia while preserving and enhancing my own position. The contrast between my careful preparation and their complete vulnerability had been stark and decisive, demonstrating the difference between strategic thinking and impulsive behavior when dealing with complex legal and financial challenges. While they'd been focused on their romantic relationship and immediate gratification, I'd been building a comprehensive case that would destroy both their lives while protecting my own interests. As I watched federal marshals escort both Mark and Sophia to detention facilities where they would await sentencing hearings that would determine whether they spent the next 20 to 40 years in federal prison, I realized that their betrayal had actually provided me with an opportunity to demonstrate my professional skills and personal strength in ways that had enhanced rather than damaged my reputation and prospects for the future. 60 days after Sophia announced her pregnancy with my husband's baby, I was signing the final paperwork for my divorce settlement while Mark and Sophia were both in federal custody awaiting sentencing hearings that would determine how many decades they would spend in prison for their crimes. The systematic destruction I'd orchestrated had exceeded even my most optimistic projections, as their complete lack of preparation for the consequences of their betrayal had made them easy targets for federal prosecutors who were celebrating one of the most successful financial fraud cases in recent memory. The sentencing phase had been particularly devastating for both defendants, as federal judges had imposed the maximum penalties allowed under sentencing guidelines due to the scope of their criminal enterprise, their lack of remorse, and their continued attempts to blame each other for crimes they'd committed together. Mark received 42 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, while Sophia received 38 years for her role as a co-conspirator in the fraud scheme that had funded their affair. The baby that had been conceived during their criminal conspiracy had been born while Sophia was in federal custody, and Child Protective Services had immediately placed the infant in foster care pending adoption proceedings that would permanently sever both parents' legal rights. The child that was supposed to represent their love and commitment had instead become another victim of their criminal behavior, growing up without any connection to the biological parents whose crimes had made family relationships impossible. My own transformation during this period had been profound and empowering, as the skills I'd developed in destroying Mark and Sophia's lives had enhanced my reputation as one of the country's most effective forensic accountants specializing in complex financial fraud cases. The federal prosecutors who'd worked on Mark's case had provided professional references that led to consulting opportunities with law enforcement agencies across the country who wanted to benefit from my expertise in exposing white-collar crime. The house that Mark had assumed he had rights to was now clearly established as my separate property, and I'd used the insurance settlement from his criminal conviction to completely renovate the space and eliminate any reminders of our failed marriage. The home that had been the setting for his betrayal was now a beautiful sanctuary that reflected my own taste and priorities rather than accommodating someone who'd been systematically deceiving me for years. My relationship with my parents had been strained but ultimately strengthened by the crisis, as they'd been forced to confront the reality that one daughter had chosen to betray her sister through an affair that was actually a criminal conspiracy, while the other daughter had demonstrated remarkable strength and strategic thinking in protecting herself and securing justice. Their initial attempts to minimize Sophia's behavior and encourage family reconciliation had ended when they understood the scope of the criminal activities and legal consequences involved. The extended family's perception of the situation had evolved from initial shock and confusion to recognition that I'd been the victim of an elaborate betrayal that included both personal and criminal elements, while Sophia and Mark had revealed themselves to be criminals whose romantic relationship was actually a conspiracy to commit federal crimes. The narrative had shifted completely in my favor as people understood the full scope of what had happened and how I'd responded with such strategic effectiveness. My professional reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by the scandal, as colleagues and clients recognized that my ability to detect and expose criminal behavior in my personal life demonstrated the same expertise that made me valuable in investigating financial fraud for law enforcement agencies and corporate clients. The case had become a showcase for my forensic accounting skills and strategic thinking that generated referrals and opportunities that expanded my practice beyond what I'd achieved during my marriage. The financial recovery from Mark's criminal activities had also provided me with resources that exceeded what I'd accumulated during our marriage, as asset forfeiture proceedings and civil litigation had resulted in my receiving compensation that reflected not just the direct damages I'd suffered but also punitive damages designed to deter similar criminal behavior. The money that Mark had stolen from investors and clients was being distributed to victims, with my claims receiving priority due to the comprehensive evidence I'd provided and my cooperation with federal prosecution. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of my recovery was the personal growth and self-confidence that had resulted from successfully navigating such a complex crisis through strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction. The betrayal that could have destroyed my life had instead demonstrated my ability to protect myself and secure justice against people who'd underestimated my intelligence and determination. The dating life I'd begun to explore was also benefiting from the confidence and independence that had emerged from surviving Mark and Sophia's betrayal. The men I was meeting were attracted to my strength and success rather than looking for someone to support or control, creating the possibility of relationships based on mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than the manipulation and deception that had characterized my marriage. The contrast between my thriving life and Mark and Sophia's complete destruction was so stark that it had become a cautionary tale within our professional and social communities about the consequences of underestimating someone with the skills and determination to fight back against betrayal and criminal behavior. The people who thought they could destroy my life while building their own happiness had instead provided me with the motivation and opportunity to demonstrate capabilities they'd never imagined I possessed. So here's my question for everyone who's followed this incredible journey from devastating betrayal to complete vindication. Have you ever had someone underestimate your ability to fight back against their cruelty so completely that their attack actually became the catalyst for your greatest success? Sometimes the people who try to destroy us are actually giving us the opportunity to show them exactly what we're capable of achieving when we're properly motivated. My sister's pregnancy announcement was supposed to be the moment when she and Mark finally revealed their victory over me and began building their happy life together on the ruins of my marriage. Instead, it became the moment when I decided that their betrayal would cost them everything they'd ever worked for, and that their criminal behavior would result in consequences they'd never imagined possible. If this story has resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about betrayal, strategic revenge, and the power of using your professional skills to protect yourself from people who think they can exploit your trust and love. Share this video with anyone who's ever been betrayed by family members or spouses, or anyone who's discovered that the best revenge against criminals is simply ensuring they face the full legal consequences of their actions. Drop a comment telling me about your own experiences with family betrayal, infidelity, or times when someone's attempt to hurt you actually motivated you to achieve more than you'd ever thought possible. Thank you for joining me on this journey from devastating betrayal to complete victory. Remember that when people reveal their true character through cruel and criminal behavior, the most powerful response is often to document everything, protect yourself strategically, and let the legal system deliver justice that's more devastating than any emotional revenge could ever be. Sometimes the best way to destroy people who betrayed you is simply to give them exactly what they deserve under the law.